In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of Niitsitapi Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Yara Nakota and Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, within the Northwest Métis homeland. Finally, we acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who live, work, and play on this land, and who honor and celebrate this territory. Hey everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of Pridecast brought to you by IKEA. I'm your host Sumit, my pronouns he, they. I handle production and programming for Calgary Pride. I'm so thrilled about the episode we have planned for you today. This year has highlighted the importance of creating space and visibility for the folks who live in our city and the importance of resilient community. Join me every Friday where we will feature guests in local community who will share their experiences as 2S LGBTQ folks in Calgary, along with sharing all of our upcoming events for a year's Pride season. Today, we are honored to have a very special guest, Landon. Landon is a deaf artist based out of Calgary, where he holds a position in deaf theater with Inside Out Theater. He's been presented with the Award of Merit for Inclusion and Access from Western Institute of Deaf and Hard of Hearing in 2018. Landon is currently developing a deaf-led ASL opera that began in Vancouver, Canada, to showcase a unique performance that will explore deaf theater into the DNA of the opera. Thank you, Landon, for being here. My first question to you is, how long you've been involved with the deaf community?
90% of deaf children come from families that are hearing. And so obviously, myself included in that percentage, I've had a lot of barriers. And so we're having to have exposure for deaf culture and deaf language. I wasn't really exposed to the deaf community until about the age of 21. So I would say maybe 10 years involvement.
Okay, great to know. From your perspective, can you share a little more about the intersection of sign language and deaf culture within the queer spaces?
Very good question. Really, I come from a small rural area of Saskatchewan, so I didn't really necessarily have that kind of exposure until I moved to Vancouver. And that's where I was able to be founded in deaf culture and that intersectionality also of the queer community as well, in the queer spaces. But we are still existing in a very small space. I feel like oftentimes in the whole gamut, you could feel very alone in a deaf queer space involved in a larger queer space. And so having to identify who we are and how I fit or how I belong is important to have queer mentors. And that was very helpful when I moved to Vancouver, so that I can carry on with language and culture, but also having other cultures that we are part of that intersectionality. Because we don't only exist in our community, being part of that small niche or a very small part. It's a beautiful experience when you're able to navigate various spaces and coexist, but a lot of people don't understand.
Landon, could you please tell us a little bit more about your opera production?
Certainly. It's been quite a bit of a journey. I am an actor, and it's been challenging. There hasn't been a lot of opportunity, and unfortunately, Canada a long time ago had banned the use of sign language, and so therefore the prevalence of use of language really became a deprivation of language, deprivation of access. Therefore, we were stunted. So we're having a resurgence, a new breath of life in the community that I exist in. And so having that exposure, I really had initially thought that art world, the art community, was only available for those that could hear. But then looking at what about the landscape of Canada? It's not only for hearing people. It is a diverse mix of population. We have had exposure and we've had difference in Canada as members of the deaf community. And so where is our voice? Where is our space? So I decided to actually take time, go to the Scandinavian parts of the world for training, such as Finland and Switzerland, Denmark and Norway, to get further training because they have sign language rights in those parts of the world. They have official languages in Canada, recognition. We do not, but they do. So when we're looking at language rights, there's the haves and have-nots. And so I wanted to become a professional actor and have a professional voice. So I had to take training out of my homeland. So I decided to develop opera skills with sign language. But signed opera is not signed opera, it's opera, sign language opera. And so then the challenge became, how do hearing and deaf counterparts work? But we can collaborate. But it's important that it become a deaf-led project, that sign language becomes the first and foremost, which is paired with music afterwards and scores and meters afterwards. So it's an intersect. It's not a layered approach, but it's that each part has equal importance. And so that creates potential opportunities, boundless opportunities. And so that's what the journey has been, and it hasn't ended yet.
Thank you. Such a beautifully presented answer.
So experiences in Vancouver, fantastic. It was just music as we identify. It's great for an audience who can hear. And when we're looking at opera, people still enjoy it, even though it may not be in their mother tongue, it may not be in spoken English, but people still enjoy it because of the music, because of the emotion that it evokes. So is that not what we're doing with art? And so it's for anyone to enjoy. And so when we have deaf opera, all audiences can access it. All audience members can enjoy it.
And that's with the music.
Correct. And many hearing patrons don't realize that signs have their own rhythm. They have their own cadence. And so when we're looking at languages that are signed, it's like beauty to the eyes. And then when you compound it with music, then you're even that more moved. When we're looking though at how deaf audience members experience art, they may not have had the opportunities just because of certain barriers. So that's the unfortunate piece, but I'm trying to break those barriers down as well.
Love it. Love it. I love to be the rule breaker and somebody who's just is shattering the status quo. So Landon, how do you as a deaf individual work in the media or opera that is such heavily or orally an auditory frame?
I personally have a music background. So I had worked with the flute for well over 12 years. I can read music, so I understand how that is used. So I incorporate both and create my own system. So I actually create a score of ASL music. So then that incorporates with rhythm. And then that way, that's how my approach has been. Now, there are different approaches by different actors and musicians. So you can't say that there's one approach that is a fit for all. But for my system, it works well for how I work the space. But I'm not going to say how I work the space is doable for everyone else. Once again, you're having to do a hybrid of a lot of works because you're looking at music. You're also having to do a lot of conversation. There's a lot of pre-work before you get to the real work. But the pre-work can be part of the real work. And sometimes that is the grunt. That is the heavy lifting part. So an example, if you're having to sometimes, when you're falling to the floor, to say, or there's movement to the floor, then the piano or the music should emphasize that. Then that way for hearing audiences and for audience members who cannot hear, at least you can feel the vibrations at the same time.
Absolutely.
And so it just evokes that emotional content.
That's great.
And context of that piece. And so oftentimes they just say, oh, you can't have music. But no. I mean, sometimes because I've used coaches and try to make sure as an ASL coach, I also work in that role, just to make sure that everything works in alignment. Because there's some that say it just can't work, can't be done, and it can be done. But you also have to do some pre-training residency as well, and just looking at things. And oftentimes that's where people get their aha moments. And so that's how I can share my experience.
Absolutely.
There's no need to be overly protective, but sometimes it's just the look and feel process is important for everyone to access it. But what makes sense is that music can be made into a visual space.
I agree.
I believe that fortunately I'm having that background. I've been very fortunate and privileged that way. Understanding music, understanding what it entails, the vocabulary, the language of that, how to use that as communication professionally on stage, and how to work with cast members, and looking at the scores of music, and how we work together from that. And so, of course, composers will do most of the work, then I provide the insight, then they provide feedback, and so it's more of a talk-back consultative approach.
So Landon, there are a lot of conversations in the theater space these days around diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are some of the impacts of having a deaf-led projects?
Often what will be seen, or what will happen is that you'll see hearing cast members learn ASL, and then they are using that language on stage. But it's not deaf-led, it's not deaf-centered, it's not authentically deaf. So 2 personal experiences to share. One theater organization here in Calgary had hired a high school deaf youth. Originally they wanted, it was actually a hearing youth for using sign language for 5 minutes. But then why is it only a 5-minute snip in the whole theater production? So why not have fully integrated language? So why not have a deaf actor? So that deaf youth.
Absolutely.
To be involved in both. So you're actually bridging both worlds, deaf and hearing culture, deaf and hearing languages. So it's not just a little tokenism that's being popped in for 5 minutes and then pulled out.
Absolutely.
And we need more of that. We, in the deaf community, and even in the communities that we coexist in, we need allies. We need everyone to help everyone to grow and to feel like we have a sense of belonging. And so unfortunately when that doesn't happen, it's quite upsetting. And I do recall of another scenario about a week when I was moving to Calgary. I was actually quite shocked because the interpreting community locally, there was some difficulties and challenges and a little bit of tension, it appeared to me. From inside out, there was a coming out monologue. And it was the first time that I'd been to something like that, and I sat in the audience. I was waiting and saw the interpreter positioned on stage, but I did not actually have access because I did not understand what was being interpreted. So I missed what was being presented in the coming out monologues. Later, I had found out that this interpreter wasn't registered nor professionally trained as an interpreter, but it was just somebody who happened to be maybe involved in the community or involved in sign language, but not necessarily a good representation of my language. So that wasn't really a good quality of provision. It was not a safe space for me to participate in the coming out monologues. And so that was my first taste of what was considered accessible in this community.
Yeah.
And so we're coming into looking at what are rights.
Absolutely.
How can I enjoy spaces? And when I'm coming from Vancouver to here, it's very different. I had an interpreting association or agency in Vancouver. I established that in 2015. It was very positive. The experience was excellent. And of course, everything now is online because of COVID. So it's been a little bit more positive in the sense that I'm able to do more remote connections like Edmonton and Vancouver and Regina. But I have found in Calgary, a lot of interpreters are not comfortable working with me. Maybe because I am too direct, maybe because I I may have a certain expectation of mannerisms and professional behavior from people that work with me. And so maybe they just don't feel comfortable working with that direct feedback that I give them. And so once again, there are barriers. And what I am trying to do is to break down the barriers so that we can find safe spaces to exist and coexist in. So I really don't know. I guess in some ways I just don't understand systematically what has happened here in Calgary, and maybe it's something I'll just have to continually learn about. And so for me, the answer, getting down to the question, here's my answer. Deaf-led helps to break down barriers. And so when we're looking at that and being a new way of framing things in the Calgary community, it has caused a lot of tension and some heated discussions. But really, when we're looking at it from that point of view, that lens, there is benefit for all. But when we're looking at an old systematic way of thinking and old systematic processes, all it does is create more barriers and push people further and marginalizes individuals, which means there's no success. I personally do believe that deaf-led theater, authentically deaf lived experiences, if they are to be on stage, on shared spaces, it should be shared, not a token space, but a shared space, meaning authentically having individuals on stage or on show, or even today, the voice comes from the author.
What can communities, including the 2S LGBTQ plus community, what can they do to be more inclusive to the deaf community?
Again, we're having to look at, when we're looking at being inclusive, I believe that we still have to have recognition not only of our languages, not via interpreting, okay? Oftentimes we'll see interpreters on stage, we'll see interpreter at events and public events, but still, once again, the interpreter is in the spotlight versus being an authentic relationship. And don't get me wrong, I mean, it's been a wonderful start. And the quality of interpreters that have been brought in have been excellent. But once again, how do we create an equal space? So, such as what's happened and what I've experienced in Vancouver. When we look at Zoe, I can't remember the last name, I'm so sorry. The goal from Zoe is that looking at genderqueer, trans safe spaces for all and teaching ASL classes so that there was no pronouns as an example in our language, so then that's something that we can simply teach the queer community, but that's something that's not being, it hasn't been activated yet in the Calgary community. And so in general, those are simple things that can be done by the queer community. The deaf community here, the deaf queer community, would love to work with the queer community as a whole, rather than our traditional model, such as the traditional practices that I've already expressed from the art community as well. Let's break those old traditions.
I'm all for that. The fact that this is the beginning and it just speaks a lot. Landon, what frustrations you as a deaf queer person often face?
How can I express it? I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about deaf culture, deaf people, and even deaf queer people in general. From the old assumptions that are still existing in the queer community. Oftentimes we're asked, well, how do you sign this and that? But it's usually signs that are part of sexual acts or sex-based, swear-based. I would much rather, can you get to know me through my culture first before I start sharing aspects of my language with you? Such as like that, you know, how do you sign this for a certain sex term or sect act? And it just, I feel like there's no respect. I've been dehumanized and I've just been basically reduced down to a sign. I feel like we get dehumanized, and we've been sort of been broken down only to, can you express, like we're a walking dictionary for others.
Yeah.
And to me, that's not shared spaces.
No.
That's just being a token in the space of, look, we have Landon here, but it's not really Landon. Do you understand?
Yeah.
There's no sharing there.
Yeah, I agree.
And also I feel like when we're looking at the queer community, when we're looking at cisgendered men, very sexualized thoughts, and they think that there's everything has to be promiscuous. And of course, there's nothing we can do about that. That's that's who or how they exist, that's fine. But I can't own that. I have to decide what is healthy for me. I cannot be for everyone else's health and benefit.
What would be your best advice to those who are facing similar challenges just like you are?
If you have to, leave those spaces. Leave Canada if you have to. Really, there are options around the whole world. United States has a very large deaf queer community.
Really?
You have to remember, the important thing is you are never alone. If you have that opportunity, grow, expand. But the only way you can do that is you sometimes just have to leave your nest.
I agree.
And so I have to say, I have to be thankful for all of those that I have met on my journey thus far, because I wouldn't be where I am at today without that exposure, without their involvement, without their consultation, and at times very direct feedback.
Well, this brings us to the end of the interview, but I do want to say that if people are interested in following your work, as an artist, of course, and as a human, how can they keep in touch with you?
To be really honest, my social media involvement has been less lately. I think my mental health, I've just had to take a little bit of time for self. And so I do have a website, www.landonkrentz.com. It's as simple as that.
I want to thank you, Landon, again for coming here and sharing their wisdom and knowledge with us. We appreciate so much the time and energy it takes to be vulnerable in these ways, and can't say enough about the value it brings to the 2S LGBTQ community in Calgary. I learned a lot more today about the deaf community and the culture than I've ever before. And I want to thank you for that.
You are welcome, and thank you for the hosting of and the questions. It's very important that we, as community members, get to share our experiences, our lived experiences. This is where we can find the human connection.
Finally, the Calgary Pride Festival at a Big Art Drive-In at Telus Park Theatre, September 1st to 5th. In true Pride style, we bring you 5 days of amazing events and programs that delight, excite, capture, captivate, and most importantly, celebrate our community. Calgary Pride Week officially runs from August 27 to September 6. Book some time off and have fun with us. We would also like to spotlight some of Calgary Pride's partners who make programs like the Pridecast possible. TD, IKEA, Suncor, University of Calgary, Air Canada, Chorus Entertainment, and of course, the many others who aren't listed here. A special round of applause for IKEA Calgary team for their resounding support of Calgary Pride this year. Don't forget to visit calgarypride.ca to find out latest details on the 2021 Big Pride Festival. Be sure to get your tickets to all your favorite events. Join us Friday for another episode of Pridecast. See you then.